we're going to get going. Perfect. Well, I think we met essentially everybody. When I found out I was on the list to do a breakout session, I thought my wife would be here, and that would be about it. So having anybody here to listen is actually very encouraging to me. So thank you for being here. It is my joy and my honor to be here. And if I can benefit you, help you, encourage you, answer any questions you may have, I will be fired up about that when I walk out of the room. So let me pray, and then we'll get going. I've got a ton of information, more information than time will allow me to get through, but want to serve you well, and that's been my prayer in the lead up to this time. So Father, I pray for that again. I want to serve this group. I want to serve them well. I pray that that which I have looked at and studied as I've considered the history of my short little time at Westside in Vancouver, just kind of trying to reflect and glean and remember and bring some things together. I just lay it before you and ask that it would be beneficial where it needs to be, helpful and encouraging, strengthening, all of those types of things, whatever needs to happen in these individuals' lives as they go from here. So I pray that where we're itching, that you would bring some measure of scratching today by way of this time. And I pray for this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. So this is the challenge or the chore or the task that was given to me. Essentially it was, I want you to do a session where you tell people about Canada, just kind of lay out what is Canada like. In addition to that, and more specifically, what is some of the differences, or what are some of the differences, and what are the similarities between Canada and the U.S., and then in particular the church. How is the church in Canada different? Where are the things that we do share, or what are the things we do share? And then talk about church planting. Talk about what is going on in church planting in Canada. What are the things that possibly we could help you with in terms of just some insight, especially if you're thinking about planting, in Canada. We do have a lot of American planters that do come up across the border, and that's fantastic, but I do think at times they do cross the border thinking that we're essentially the same. And we do have a lot of similarities, but we do have some differences as well. And so that's kind of the big picture. So talk about Canada, differences, similarities, what is going on church and church-wise, church planting-wise, and then open it up to questions on the back end. All right? Sound okay? Just to give you a little bit of bio of me, name is Norm, 52 years old. I know, believe it or not, 52 years old. Some people think I'm older than that. Some people think I'm younger than that. 52, married to Nicole for 24 years. I have two boys, 17. Matthew is 17 and Mike is 15. Very different, but lovely boys who love Jesus and are growing in faith. One of my boys, my oldest, is planning on going to Cape Rain, Australia next year. Very jealous about that. He's more the artistic side of things. My other boy, 15, scholar athlete. Straight A's, good athlete. And I'm not sure what he's going to do. I think he's going to have sort of the pick of the litter in terms of his choices if things continue on the way they are. He takes after his mom in the smarts department. I've been pastoring for 25 years in 3 different places. Most recently, a church that I planted 13 years ago that has since planted 4 other churches, all in the Vancouver area. To be specific, 3 other churches in this weird partnered campus that essentially functions like a standalone church. So 4 different churches, let's call them, with plans by God's grace to plant more. We have a desire right now. At least we're in the prayerful stage of considering planting in Winnipeg, of all places. We actually have a guy on site, a resident on site, apprentice on site, who is feeling called to plant in Winnipeg. I don't know why. It's cold there. It's hard there. And so if he's feeling called to go there, then it has to be of God. So we're prayerfully considering that. And also looking back, way back east, even to places like Halifax, but those are right now just prayerful dreams. And then possibly doing something in and around Vancouver and the area in the next couple of years as well. I'll talk more about that story on the back end, so let me just double back and begin where I said in my intro, and that is just telling you a little bit about Canada, I know some of you know a lot about Canada, but some of you may not. So let me do that. Just talk about our countries a little bit, similarities and differences. First of all, just kind of beginning with the population of Canada. Canada is 36 million in size, which if you compare it to the States, obviously means it's a lot smaller. The U.S. is about 325 million in size. It means that we're 1/9 the size of you. To go further, to break it down a little bit, in Canada, 9 million people self-identify as Catholic, or excuse me, backwards. 13 million self-identify as Catholic, 9 million as Protestants. So about 22 million people self-identify, or 2/3 of the country self-identify as Catholic or Protestant. In the States, those numbers are actually flipped upside down, meaning that there are more people who self-identify as Protestants, about 150 million in your country if you're from the States, and 68 million identify as Catholics. There's 18,000 Protestant churches in Canada. In the United States, there are 300,000 Protestant churches here. That means that there's one, for every one person in Canada, or excuse me, for every one church in Canada, there's about, one church for every 2,000 people, and in the States, one church for every 1,083 people. So again, in terms of just the amount of churches that you have here in the States versus what we have in Canada, it's about 1 to 2 in terms of what you have. We have 150 churches in Canada that are 1,000 or more. In the States, you have about 7,000 churches that are 1,000 or more. So just giving you a little sense of the differences and the similarities between the two, but mainly when it comes to those types of things, lots of differences. The largest church we have in Canada, and I debate this a little bit, but I'm just going from what I've seen online and in discussion with people, is a church in Winnipeg called Springs Church of about 8,000. The largest church that you have in the U.S. is Joel Osteen's church in Houston of about 43,500. There are 50 churches in Canada that average 2,000 a Sunday or weekly attendance, which is a Canadian megachurch. That, in some churches down in the States, is like the size of your parking team, right? Saddleback, for example. But that's a mega church in Canada. The median, meaning 50% more or 50% less sized church in Canada, and again, it's hard to pigeonhole or just kind of just hammer down and get the exact number, is somewhere around 100 people, but I think it's maybe even a little bit less. It's about the same here in the U.S., in fact. That gives you a bit of a flyover of the two countries. And so my point in just kind of highlighting that is to let you know that just because we're 1/9 the size of you, that doesn't necessarily mean that everything works out with those kind of numbers. There are things that you have here in the States that are great in number compared to where we are. Similarities that Canada has with the U.S., well, we have many similarities. We have huge similarities. The case in point that I think highlights this the most is that we are essentially equal with China as being your largest trade partner. Even though China is 39 times our size. We trade with you about $662 billion a year in goods crossing our borders. I only highlight that just to point out that we share a lot. We share a lot. Now, this is a good thing. It means we have a lot in common, but it also leads people to think we have everything in common. But we do share a lot. We share food, we share language, although I'll talk about that a little more in detail. We import your media, for example. We export our talent. There are people that are famous in your country that have come from Canada, whether you realize it or not. Justin Bieber's a Canadian, right? We know about that, but we have more than that too. Ryan Reynolds is a Canadian. Jim Carrey, Seth Rogen went to my high school. People like William Shatner is Canadian, but we have others. Celine Dion, Michael J. Fox, Rachel McAdams, James Cameron, Ryan Gosling, Drake, right? Evangelina Lilly, Dan Aykroyd, Keanu Reeves, Mike Myers, John Candy, Martin Short. Even The Rock has some Canadian ties. Right? His dad is born in Nova Scotia. So we have a lot of things in common. Again, just trying to make sure that we get that. And that's just the tip of the spear. And my point is we do share. We do share. We share a lot. But there are differences. And what are they? What are the differences between Canada and the U.S.? Well, again, size for one. We're 1/9 your size in population. And yet Canada is actually a little bit larger in scope and size geographically. But here's the thing about that. We don't want to live in most of it. And so what we do is we huddle really close to the border. We get as close as we can to you. But we spread ourselves across from coast to coast. We don't have anything in any place that's warm. We don't have a Hawaii, we don't have a Florida, we don't have a Palm Springs that we're jealous and we're angry that we don't. So that's Canada. So we are the same size even though we're 1/9 the size. Canada spends about $20 billion annually on defense. The U.S. spends about $610 billion on defense. We're glad you are our friends, in other words, right? We huddle close. We want to keep on being your friends. Canada's GNP, our gross national product, is about $1.57 trillion. It's smaller than California's. California's gross national product all by itself is $2.2 trillion. The United States gross national product is about $18.75 trillion. We have two official languages. We have French and English. The United States doesn't have an official language, whether you realize that or not. You have a preferred language. You have a dominant language, but not an official one. Canada has how many provinces? 10 provinces, 3 territories. The United States doesn't have provinces, as you know. They have 50 states. They have 1 district, and they have 5 territories, major territories, 16 in total. We have a prime minister. You have a president. Neither of us really like our prime minister or our president. The favorable ratings are down for both. In Canada, we have a prime minister named Justin Trudeau. His favorable rating or approval rating is 44%. Currently, Trump is at 41%. So we have a prime minister, you have a president. Canada is a constitutional monarchy, which means the queen is the head of our state, and our prime minister is the head of government. You're a republic, which means your president is the head of both. A few more things that I can give you in terms of our differences. You have a right to bear arms in the States. We don't. It's considered a privilege in Canada to bear arms, sort of like driving a car. As of yesterday, just yesterday, 24 hours ago, pot is now legal in Canada across the nation. For you, it is not legal across the nation. Again, as you know, it's left up to the individual states. Canada legalized gay marriage in 2005. You legalized gay marriage in the States in 2015. The reason why I point that out is that 10-year gap starts to play its way out in terms of other things, especially as it relates to the church. The things that you encounter, there's a good chance that Canada has encountered it 10 years previous. In the same way that it's probably been experienced 10 years previous in Europe. And so, as you look ahead, trying to determine the things that you may be going through 10 years from now, look to Canada today. In the same way that if we want to know what our future is like, we don't look to the States as much as we look to the UK and other places besides. Canada has there are about 100,000 abortions a year. There are about 600,000 to 700,000 in the United States, a high of about 1.2 million. But that just shows you that as it pertains to the demographics, there are more abortions per capita in Canada than there are in the States. There were 611 homicides in Canada in 2016. There were 600 homicides in Chicago in 2016. There were 17,250 in the U.S. in 2016. We have free health care. You're working on it. Your legal drinking age is 21. Ours is 19 in most places, 18 in Alberta. You have an eagle, we have a beaver. You have the stars and stripes, we have a maple leaf, and so on. One last thing, our currency is different. Yours is far more powerful. It costs us about $1.30 of our money to buy one of yours. And that goes up and down all the time. But what you have in terms of power in your currency, ours is just pretty. All right, we use a lot more color, and it's just a nicer looking currency, but we'd rather have yours. We could absolutely exchange prettiness for power. So that's just some differences. So similarities, differences. So let's go a little bit deeper before we start talking about religion in Canada and church planting in particular. What do Canadians think of Americans? Now, take this, I love you, right? I love you lots, and I'm going to be gracious with you, but what do Canadians think of Americans? Well, we like you, we really do. We like our American brothers and sisters very much, but we're the kind of family where one of the siblings has gotten a lot more successful than the other ones, right? You're the successful sibling. And so there is this, a little bit of a slight inferiority complex that Canadians have in comparison to their brothers and sisters to the north. This may not be the same across the board, but it certainly is common. There is this also what I would call a subtle resentment. It will never be shared because Canadians are also nice people, so they'll never share it publicly, but there is this subtle resentment that you will sniff every once in a while in a Canadian in regards to their relationship to their brothers and sisters to the south. Because of your success, we think that at times at least, and please hear this, you can just be just a tad arrogant, just a tad. Because you're so successful. And why would there not be that tendency? You have a tendency to call things world championships, even though they involve your country only. For example, right? Right? It's just a small little thing, but it just seeps out a little bit, and it's noticed around the world in other countries where you go, how is that? The term ugly American is earned, but it's not entirely fair. Canadians, as I said, are often characterized as nice, but I know a number of Canadians who are far from nice, and I know many, many Americans who are far from ugly, and therefore we need to be careful of stereotypes. Canadians, just a couple of more things just to point out. Canadians, like most Americans, are very proud of their country and being citizens of it, but are far less overtly patriotic. You won't see many flags being flown outside homes in Canada like you will in certain part of the States with the stars and stripes. We are also comfortable with our place and status in the world. We know full well that just south of the border is the strongest military and the strongest economy in the world. We know that full well. We get that very much. And we understand it. We also know that the U.S. has some wonderful things that we don't have and we sort of look at from afar. You have New York, and you have Wall Street, and you have Broadway, you have Los Angeles, and you have Hollywood, and you have the Oscars, you have Apple, and you have Amazon, and you have Microsoft. You have Tim Keller, for crying out loud, right? And we're jealous. I mean, when was the last time you heard of Tim Keller quoting a Canadian? Right? You just don't ever hear that. But you'll hear Canadian after Canadian after Canadian, right? Quoting Tim Keller. So you have a lot of things that we look at and go, that's fantastic. We have beer and poutine and hockey, right? That's basically what we have, and we haven't won a Stanley Cup in Canada since 1993, right? So that's who we are. And so Canadians, as I hope I'm just highlighting for you, are more what would be a good word? We're more willing to make fun of ourselves. We can be self-deprecating. But what that also means is that we resist those who puff themselves up, those who present themselves as experts, those who have a lot of bravado. There is this expression called the tall poppy syndrome, where we have this desire to cut people down to size, to not present yourself as that, but present yourself foibles and all and go, this is who we are. Some differences that I think are important to note. And then lastly, Canadians are also more highly educated than those across the border. In fact, studies show that we're number one in the world with 57% of our citizens having some form of higher education. That will show itself in in a city and those you minister to. That's followed by Japan, by the way, Israel, Korea, the UK, and then the US. Canadians more often than not know more about the US than Americans know about Canada. In fact, I went on a bus tour with Nicole yesterday, and our bus tour guide, when he found out we were from Vancouver, asked if that was in Canada. We were surprised by the question, but
it was in the States.
Yeah.
Okay.
So let me move from there. Let me actually just stop here. Any questions? That's just a flyover. All right. Let me move on. And let me kind of direct things from there to start talking about religion in Canada, what's going on, how does it differ, and how is it similar to the U.S. And I'll just say this on the front end, it's very similar. There are a lot of things that we share in this regard, but then there are things that are quite different, especially as I get to the city of Vancouver and start talking about it. As I said earlier, about 2/3 of Canadians identify as Catholic or Protestant, but those numbers are dropping, as they are dropping in your country as well. And I know not everybody is here from the States, but I'll just put it that way. 4 decades ago, 47% of Canadians identified as Catholic. So 1 out of every 2. Today that number has dropped to 39%. 41% of people identified as Protestant 4 decades ago. That number is now 27%. So both are dropping, and they've dropped significantly over the last 40 years. Although it's hard to peg exactly, and you'll find slight variables as you go on and look, and as I've talked to people, and as others have discussed this topic as well, but about 4% of all people living in Canada would identify as evangelical. In the city in which I pastor, that number is probably below 3%. And as I do the math and think about Vancouver proper and just try to add up the number of evangelical churches just in the city of Vancouver, I think that's a fairly accurate number. In other words, there is a ton of room. That number is tiny to those people in our country who believe that Jesus is the only way to salvation. In contrast to that drop, and I'm no expert on this topic, but I can certainly read, and I certainly see it, in my personal ministry, and that has been the rise of the nuns. You know that expression. That is those people who self-identify as having no religious affiliation. That number has increased from 4% to 24% over the past 4 decades. So 24% in Canada, across the board. That number, by the way, in the United States is 20%, so fairly level with where we're at. We also have seen an increase of those who identify as part of another religion. That number has increased over the last 4 decades from 4% to 11%. The number increasing predominantly through immigration. Although some Eastern religions are having influence in our country as well. For example, in Vancouver, Buddhism is sort of the flavor of the day. So this is people who've been born and raised in the country and the influence of Eastern religions making their way in. Certainly tied into the yoga craze that we have in Vancouver, but again across the board as well. In the decade of the 70s, and this is why I gave you these numbers, because I'm going to give you a list of these things, and again, I encourage you to take a look at that handout. But in the decade of the 70s, 56% of those who immigrated into Canada identified as either Protestant or Catholic. But in the first decade of the 2000s, that has dropped to 39%. So those who identified as being part of another religion, that has increased, however. So those who came in decades ago came in as saying, I identify as a Protestant or Catholic, that has dropped. But those individuals now immigrating or coming in now, that number has increased in terms of being part of another religion. That number has gone up from 23% to 39%. The nuns have remained essentially unchanged. So, in other words, what I'm trying to help you see is Protestants decreasing, Catholics decreasing, nuns increasing, those coming in, not Protestant as much as they were, not Catholic as much as they were, part of another religion instead. So that's sort of the flavor of the day. But I need to even take it a little bit narrower And if you're looking at Canada as a country and going, are these numbers the same across the country? The answer is no. In fact, the farther west you go, you'll see a greater increase of those who designate themselves as nuns, as having no religious affiliation. In the West, so just the western provinces, that number, which is 24% in Canada, is 44% in the West. It's most prolific in the city in which I pastor at just over 48%. So one out of every two people that live in Vancouver will say, I have no religious affiliation whatsoever. In Atlantic Canada, that number, so the Atlantic province region, that number drops to 16%. In Quebec, it drops to 12%. So 48% in Vancouver, go into Quebec, Montreal, Quebec City, that number drops way down. But here's what you need to know about Quebec, for example. Even though people are still willing to identify themselves with Catholicism or some sort of Protestant stream, they don't go to church. In fact, the least churched area in North America is in Quebec, and if you want to target a specific city that is an absolute spiritual wasteland, Quebec City. We took a bus tour there. We like bus tours. We seem to take bus tours all the time, but we love. And all we saw in that city when we drove around was church after church after church. Now a bookstore, now a museum. Just what we heard a little bit earlier today. But I mean, it is a spiritual wasteland. There are some good things going on in Quebec and Atlantic Canada that I'll hit a little bit later. But just because a person identifies themselves as such, especially in those places, doesn't mean that they're going to any type of religious service. Just so you get a little sense of the differences and similarities between Canada and the States. So in Western Canada, I said 44% will identify as a nun, no religious affiliation. If you drop down into the Western states, that number is closer to 26%. Which, to me, when I travel down to places like Seattle and Portland and farther south, I get that sense. That there is something going on in Vancouver in terms of people's affinity for the church that is less than when I go down to those places, again, south of the border. In the south in the United States, that number goes down to 15%. And if you're from the States, that probably makes a lot of sense. The Western states are a lot different than the Deep South, for example. And I don't think this would be a surprise for you to know that the nuns are far more prominent the younger the demographic you are. So in Canada, that number is 24% across the board. It's 29% for those that were born after 1967. And again, I don't think that's a surprise to you. Questions at that point? Anything that I can help you with? Giving you a lot of data. All right, I'm not an expert in data, so I'm just kind of pouring this stuff out. I want to make sure that you're okay. What about church attendance then? What's going on in Canada that way? Well, again, some stats that I'll throw your way before I make some summary comments, and then just start talking specifically about church planting, which is an area that I have a great love and want to talk to you about much. In 1986, 43% of Canadians said they attended a religious service at least once a month. 1986, 43%. That number was 54% in the United States. In 2010, so 24 years later, 27% of Canadians said they did. So once a month, 46% in the U.S. The greatest decline over that time was seen in Quebec, against the province of Quebec. Their decline went down 31%. Do you know the last uptick, by the way, across the board in church attendance? Across the board in any age stage, both in Canada and the United States? Across the board, attendance went up? What? 9/11. Isn't that interesting? 2001 to 2004, across the board, every age, every demographic went up for those 2.5 years. Just a side note, I'd rather talk about this. When we talk about revival, when we talk about people coming back or coming for the first time, I wonder if it's not our success and our ease that is actually our greatest hindrance. I wonder if it's not great tragedy that is going to precede. If it's not going to be greater apostasy, greater persecution that's going to see people doing what we just got a taste of in 2001 to 2004. Because when the fear of 2001 sort of dissipated, when it no longer became our problem, so to speak, what did people do? They left again. Prosperity, ease, and the like. And so I wonder how passionate we actually are for revival. If it's going to be persecution, which seems to be what history suggests it will take, it's the persecution that led to the great scattering that we just heard about in Acts chapter 8. It's the persecution that leads to great missionary endeavors. It's the persecution where our faith becomes real. Our passion for God becomes utmost. And so I wonder, but it's interesting when you look at the number. To summarize, so lots of stuff. So what's the summary? Less people in Canada go to church today, so too in the U.S. More people identify as having no religious affiliation, with those numbers only increasing as the generation has children and so on and so on. Those numbers will go up. Immigration is introducing other religious streams into the culture. Is that a bad thing? Of course not. It means the world is coming here. It means the mission field is coming here as well. Canada is also not the same across the land. The West is far more religiously unaffiliated, especially if you're a millennial or part of Generation Z. However, although those in the East are willing to identify, as I said, as Catholic or Protestant, they will not darken the doorway of a church and participate in any religious service of any kind. So what is the conclusion? As we segue to talking about church planting, the conclusion is the needs are huge. They're huge. They're huge here in the States, certainly, but they're huge as well, and in some places, greatly huge in Canada. It also means that the field is ripe. I don't think we need to look at these things as, yes, it's negative on one hand, but the opportunities are grand. The field is ripe, with the mission field coming to us, but the workers need to be aware, because the ground rules are different. And the baseline has changed with the assumption about common ground needing to be recalibrated. See, there's huge swaths of people, both in Canada and the U.S., who have absolutely zero Christian foundation to speak of. They have no common language whatsoever. They've been raised by parents who don't share any understanding of any faith stream whatsoever in terms of whether it's Protestant or Catholic, raising their kids to never experience the same. And so the language has to be recalibrated, and thus our teaching and our training, not only from the pulpit, but teaching those in our ministries who are going out every week as they scatter, they need to be trained up so they too can share with a group of people that don't share the same foundation. In addition, conclusions coming out of the data, Canada is far more post-Christian than the U.S., mirrors what's taking place, as I said, in certain parts of Europe. If you want to know what you'll look like again 10 or 15 years from now, look to the north as we look across the pond to the UK. If all things remain the same, that is. So what about church planting? So I've heard a number of you are thinking about church planting. What about church planting? Well, Ed Stetzer, who is hosting our conference, they did a huge research and study on church planting in Canada, the largest that had ever been done in Canada. And it shouldn't be a surprise coming out of what I just gave you and what their research evidence to know that there are differences in church planting in Canada versus the U.S. as well. Generally, it's a tougher slug in Canada. But here's my encouragement. Good things are going on, and God is moving. Let me give you some stats. You can look in that handout that you downloaded. In Canada, the average church plant after 3 years averages about 61 attendance. So across the board. In the United States, the average church plant after 3 years is average in attendance 95. So we start smaller in Canada and we grow slower as well. The new believers that we see coming by way of the data is smaller in Canada, lower in scope in Canada in comparison to the States. By year 3, church plant in Canada will realize, on average, about 20 new believers. That's actually really encouraging when I heard that number. In the U.S., after 3 years, that number is 43. Suggests that it's harder soil, perhaps. It also suggests that the necessity of training up people to speak into the lives of those who have very little foundation, if any, takes a little bit longer to pass on. Financially speaking, 58% of all church plants in Canada planted since 2005, so 13-year window, 56 are not financially self-sufficient. So over half of all church plants over 13 years right now that exist in Canada are not yet financially self-sufficient. 31% for the same period in the U.S., so about 25% greater in terms of not self-sufficient in Canada. 1/3 of all church plants in Canada are self-sufficient by year 5. So 1/3, 1 out of 3 church plants, and then 1/2 in comparison in the U.S. by year 5. So the overarching point in all of this, coming out of the study and quoting from Stetzer's work, is Canada's post-Christian climate is more similar to countries in Europe where liftoff is slower. And yet here's the good news. The good news is those church plants, and this is coming out, I encourage you to take a look at this, those church plants dedicate themselves to 3 things. So you're thinking about coming in, planting here or across the border. Church plants that dedicate themselves to prayer, so weekly prayer, dedicate themselves to evangelism, purposeful evangelism, and thirdly, to training up their people to be missionaries, are all seeing success. Greater success than those that don't. And it's staggering when you take a look at the numbers. They're seeing greater conversion growth, baptism, financial stability, and increasing numerical growth across the board, especially in comparison to churches that don't. To put it simply, although hard in Canada, and where is it not, church planting is proving effective if you dedicate yourselves to those things. Again, prayer, evangelism, purposeful evangelism, and training up your people to be missionaries. Making your membership class not a sign on the dotted line, but this is a partnership in the gospel that you're considering. And if you're considering this and you want to be a part of this ministry, this is what we're calling you to. It's wonderful. It's actually, it's affirming. It's encouraging, because you can get really depressed when you start looking at the numbers. So it's very encouraging that way. Here's some additional good news just to encourage you as well. Although church attendance is dropping across the board, there is one segment where it is not in Canada, where it is actually growing. And that one segment where it is growing in Canada is in those churches who would classify themselves as theologically conservative and who hold a more traditional view of core beliefs. There is a study that came out, 2 individuals, can't remember the school in Canada that put it on, but the results were laid out in Maclean's magazine. I actually have the quote in that handout that I passed on to you. Let me read it for you. Maclean's is like the Time of Canada. And this is what it says. We found that clergy and congregants of the growing mainline Protestant churches were significantly more theologically conservative. The declining church clergy, so those who were overseeing churches that were declining, were least likely to hold traditional Christian beliefs. When we use statistical analysis to determine which factors are influencing growth, they lay them out. Conservative Protestant theology, with its more literal take on the Bible, was a significant predictor. Conversely, our analysis showed liberal theology, with its metaphorical reading of Scripture, leads to decline. A couple more paragraphs. Our research is not alone in concluding that churches with conservative doctrine grow. In Canada, when growing churches have been identified by other national and international studies, they have been almost exclusively conservative in doctrine. What makes our study unique is that past studies have claimed theology and church growth are not linked. Our statistical analysis proves that they are. Sums it up. The article is summed up this way. The answers reveal a sharp divide. Growing churches believe far more strongly than declining ones in traditional Christian orthodoxy, basic articles of faith, the ancient creeds, the authority of Scripture, God's visible working in the world today, the exclusivity of Christianity, meaning Jesus as the door to eternal life, and the importance of daily prayer. Now, if that was just an article read, it'd be kind of encouraging. But I can say firsthand that the churches and the leaders that I know that hold to that in Canada, it's proving true. My friends and associates that I know in other ministries, whether it's Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, Toronto, Montreal, Halifax, all I'm hearing is growth. All I'm hearing is campuses started, plants going out. So this is, I can tell you firsthand, what I'm seeing, at least from my vantage point, is this is absolutely taking place. Question?
What about the data of new believers versus those that have been established churches that are moving towards that? So you can see growth in numbers.
Mm-hmm.
But more liberal theology and churches there are pushing away those conservatives. Any analysis there as new versus established churches? Believers.
Can you rephrase the question a little bit?
So the growth, is that coming from new believers in those traditional churches, or is it shifted from one side?
How much of it is transition?
Yeah, transfer growth versus new believer growth. I don't have those numbers. I can say this in terms of just my own personal experience. We see both. And I'm not surprised. My mentor used to always say this, and I've used it all the time, is we don't steal sheep, but we do grow grass. And what I mean by that, there are a lot of people that are very hungry that are part of ministries and they're just not getting fed. And so there's a part of me that's not always necessarily ashamed that we're seeing people coming from different ministries where they're not being fed. But if all we do is measure our success, quote-unquote success, in terms of growth numerically by just transfer growth, that's an issue, obviously. And it's one of those things that as we look at our ministry, we want and pray all the time that we would see new believer growth. But this this article doesn't give the specifics of those numbers. The thing about what was really interesting about this article, it was actually just focused on what is called, what article references as mainline denominations. Those very liberal denominations, the United Churches in Canada, for example, the Presbyterian Church in Canada, are very, very liberal in their theology. And yet they went to the churches within those mainline denominations that were growing, and they started asking why. What did they believe? And that's what this article is about, is those leaders of these mainline churches that were growing were actually these sort of rogue leaders that were holding to more conservative theology, what we would call traditional views of the Christian faith. And they're seeing growth, even in this bastion of wasteland that have been, at least in Canada, our mainline denominations. Yes, please.
Just a quick comment. If you want to track transfer versus conversion growth, look at baptisms. That's a really interesting way to compare where people are coming from.
I couldn't agree more with you. Yeah. Just that celebration of baptisms, absolutely. That number. If all you have is, again, just growth numerically and you don't see people wanting to get in the water, right, as we're doing this next Sunday, I mean, those sweet, sweet days. Yeah, please.
As far as evangelism goes, some more close Christian context, of course you can't be using like some level of higher evangelism methods and things. So what type of methods do you guys use? Like something I'm trying to in Chicago is like kind of the Fort Fields, No Place Left, Three Circles, conversation guides, and things like that. Where's the things you guys have seen that's been successful in engaging those in more of a close Christian context?
Yeah, some of the stuff we do is not rocket science or anything new, and Graham, and we've just in the last year or so started using Alpha, like many churches have,
Yeah.
and we've seen a few people come to Jesus that way. Most of what I would call those people coming to Jesus at Westside over the years have been what I call the accidentally saved. Those people who left the church for some of them up to decades, coming back and realizing, you know what, I thought I knew what Christianity was all about, and I don't, and I didn't. And then just more pure evangelism, friendship evangelism. And then again, just those who have been invited on a Sunday, started coming, stayed, came to Jesus that way. So we haven't done a lot of what we would call in the church big outreach events.
Yeah.
We haven't really given ourselves to that. Doesn't mean that we're against that. It doesn't mean that we won't do it down the line. And then I would say, in addition to that, the reason why we plant churches is because new church plants, with that fervency and excitement, especially when you have that core team going out, that evangelism spike, because if they don't invite, this thing isn't surviving. Many of them planting in places where they live, so now they can invite them to where, is close by. So that's why we give ourselves, our mission statement is making Jesus known, and we believe the best way we can do that is by planting churches. So that's our missional work. So all of those things. But I think we have lots to learn too. I would never try to defend what we've done at Westside. I think we can do a far better job. And Matt, who's on staff, would concur, and my wife and Melissa as well. So with that in mind, I've got about 12 minutes. Let me tell you a little bit about our story and a little bit about Vancouver. And then on the back end, I'll try to do this I can't do this very quickly, but I'll try. A little snapshot, because I was asked, tell us about Vancouver. You heard a little bit about Chicago today. Let me tell you about Vancouver. Vancouver, medium-sized town. About 647,000 people live in Vancouver. However, the greater Vancouver area, about 2.5 million in size, is very close to Portland. So if you've ever been to Portland, Portland is about 640,000 people, 2.4 in the surrounding area. Vancouver, very small geographically. Very small geographically. Vancouver, if you've ever been there, you'll know this, hammered into the north with the mountains, to the west with the ocean, and to the south with the United States. We're very close to the border. So all of our growth has to go east, and that's what it looks like. However, the Vancouver proper, the area that is just Vancouver proper, is very small. And in fact, is the most densely populated city in Canada, and is number 6 in North America. To give you a number, 5,493 people live in per square kilometer in Vancouver, which is, just to give you some comparisons, 3,200 in Seattle and 2,900 in Los Angeles. New York's 10,000. Hong Kong, 25,000 per square kilometer. But it's very densely populated. It's also very ethnically diverse. 46% white, 43% Asian. So 1.7% black. So essentially, 50-50 almost between white and Asian in Vancouver. And if you've ever been there, that shouldn't be a surprise. That wouldn't be a surprise to you. What else can I tell you? Almost half of all Sikhs, Punjabi Sikhs in Canada, live in Vancouver. It's a prominent demographic. If you meet an Indian, meaning a person from India in Vancouver, there is an almost guaranteed chance that they are a Punjabi Sikh from northern India. And they traditionally live in very centered parts of the city, all around their temple. Very, very involved in politics, and a very, very important demographic. It's also expensive to live in Vancouver as well. The average home price in Vancouver is $1.1 million in the GVRD. If you go into Vancouver proper, an average home will start you at about $3 million. And that will be a teardown, which a lot of people do with their $3 million homes. The average condo, 2-bedroom condo in Vancouver starts at about $1.2 million, meaning in Vancouver proper. The religious makeup, I touched upon this already, 48.9% nuns in Vancouver, 36% call themselves Christian, 6.8% call themselves Sikh, and then 5.7% call themselves Buddhist. As I also said, and it's hard to pin down, perhaps less than 3% evangelical. So the room for growth and opportunity is huge. Quickly, my story a little bit, then I'll leave you with some takeaways. I planted Westside in 2005. I'm a born and raised Vancouverite. We planted it in an area of Vancouver just outside of the center of Vancouver in a small movie theater. In 2009, we planted our first church out of Westside when we were about 275 people in size. In 2012, we started a second campus, which we actually set free. They are now standalone churches this last year. In 2013, we planted another standalone church, and then last year we started that partnered campus. And so over the 13 years, we've taken our ministry, by God's grace, grown our ministry, but planted four other ministries outside of it, again with some desires to do some things in the future. What have we learned? And I'll close with this. What have we learned along the way to encourage you? The first is preaching matters. Preaching matters with prayer undergirding it all. What we have found, and this may be something maybe exclusive to what our experience has been, although I'm doubtful, and that is people don't want their time wasted. If they're going to get up and shower and they haven't darkened the doorway of the church for years, perhaps even decades, they don't want a happy, clappy message. They want someone that will call them, lead them, teach them, who will, even if they disagree with you, be confronted with the joy and the challenge that is the gospel. We've found that people aren't resistant to preaching; they're just resistant to bad and thoughtless preaching. Secondly, out of a couple that I'll leave you with, being indigenous is helpful, but it's not necessary. What I mean by that is I'm a Vancouver born and raised kid who planted a church in the city in which he grew up. And I think that's been helpful, but it's not altogether necessary. However, I will add this. If you come to Canada wanting to plant a church from the States, you start with some added difficulty. There is a great, I'll just speak personally. I have greater affinity with a person who's come from Ireland than a person who's come from Texas in Vancouver. I just have I have a commonality that I share, and I can't really put my finger on it. I think you'll have a greater opportunity of planting if you came from the UK or Australia in Vancouver than if you came from Alabama. It'll be very, very hard for you. Not impossible, but there are things that you have to recognize. Another takeaway. The importance, and I touched upon this, the importance of the call and training along with not just your own training, but training your body for the mission. The reference from Acts chapter 8, which was spoken of in the panel, Acts chapter 8, verse 4, where the persecution by way of Saul with the stoning of Stephen, where it says, and they scattered with the word of God, is my philosophy of ministry. That every week we say goodbye to our people and they scatter, and the question is, what do they scatter with? So just in case they run up against an Ethiopian eunuch, they have something to say to them. So if they open it up and go, I've been reading from Isaiah 53, who is this about? They can say it's about Jesus. So we need to train our people up. From the pulpit, midweek classes, one-on-one discipleship, and the like. The greatest outreach event is what happens when we say goodbye to our people every week. And so what are they scattering with when they're going into their places of influence? Fourth of 5, community is important. You'll hear about that, but I'll add this. It's important until it infringes on the rights of the individual. And you have to be aware of that. So we talk a lot about community in the church. People talk about how they want community in the church. They want it to a point. And when community infringes on the right of the individual, which is a pillar in our culture, right? I have to do what's right for me. I have to take care of me. We have to be aware that we have to define what community is all about, and it's more than just getting together and sharing a meal. In fact, my challenge, I've just been thinking about this over the last number of weeks, is we really have to talk less about community and more about what true fellowship is. And why do we need fellowship? And how does fellowship and community, if you like, how does that even supersede my rights as an individual? You'll butt up not only against a Vancouver right, any city, any person living in any city. So we have to be aware of that as well. And lastly, from my experience in Vancouver, house churches have not proven successful. I'm not saying they're wrong. They just haven't proven successful. So if you're thinking of coming up to Vancouver and starting a house church movement, I'm not saying don't try. But it will be a battle. What I have seen are ministries that are dedicated, I'll borrow my own language, dedicated to the gathering and the scattering of God's people. They have proven successful. More so. I use this analogy, and I'll close with this, often. The back row is as important as the living room couch if you want to reach people in our city. And what I mean by that is I want a place where the 40-year-old .com millionaire who's living in Cole Harbour in Vancouver, a very hoity-toity area of Vancouver, can come in 10 minutes late by himself, herself, sit in the back row, take something in, and then leave without talking to somebody. They need to have that opportunity at least for a while. There are people, because I know how I'm shaped. If I'm checked, I'd rather come in 5 minutes late, sit down, and leave 5 minutes early. You have to have a back row, and you have to have a living room couch. But if you think you're going to get everybody with your living room couch, sometimes you need the back row for a year before they even are willing to consider sitting on your living room couch. And then there are people who are all over your living room couch, right? They love it. You need both, would be my challenge and encouragement. And then ministries of movement along the way. Justice ministry, helps ministry, missions, outdoors ministry, all that type of stuff is also important in relationships and friendships. Look at that, I stopped and I had so much more to say. Go ahead.
You planted, what are the distance one church
The churches I planted outside of Westside, or we planted, the first church that we planted in 2009 was about 3 kilometers away, so about 1.8 miles. All the churches that we've planted locally, except this last partner campus, have all been within about 6-7 kilometers where we were meeting. So 4 miles, roughly. The first was very close. We were treating 75 people. It was very close to us. The second, about 5 clicks away, our campus, even though it's on the other side of the water, very close. We had people, when we planted all those churches, people that were attending Westside, and they weren't driving a long time to get to us on a Sunday morning, but we planted them specifically because of the area where they were coming from. So, the first church that we planted, they had some bumps along the way. They're about 150 adults to about 200. The church on the North Shore is about 250 people on a weekend. The church to the south is about 500 people. They've since planted another campus. And the church the partnered campus that we planted a little bit further out, I got a summary last week, there were about 390 people. And then our ministry downtown is about 1,200 adults on a Sunday with a couple hundred people. This will give you some context of where we're at. Please.
Comment, 2 questions. First of all, I super encourage you to visit Westside last year. It was right after Charlottesville, and then it's here in the States. And I just had a conversation on like racial different levels. Here is more recognizing it was wrong, and that's I think where the church was saying it's wrong. Whereas in Canada, I think when you were praying for there, we just spent time about, hey, given that this exists, what can we do?
City's point of view,
Yep.
churches are a drain.
Yeah.
Oftentimes because they don't pay property taxes, they don't pay income taxes,
Yep.
and they tend to be insulated. Do you subtract for those things? I'm just curious.
No, we say again the question.
Opportunity cost,
Yeah.
because if it wasn't for a church, it would be a business there that could contribute something else. So.
Yeah, so there's other directions to take the calculation, but what this answers is things when I was in budget meetings as a counselor and would come up like that, and you would say, well, no, they're kind of good, they should be there, but you don't have anything pragmatic to say about them. I would say now in those cases, and I've been at many trade shows and stuff where I've talked to mayors and counselors, and I'd say, well, fine, if you don't want them, let's say you want to tax them, or you want to put extra burdens on them because you don't think they're carrying their share. But if there's 50% less of them in your community in 10 years, your quality of life in that community will be lower because you can't possibly afford to fill the gap. The reality is municipalities are so cash strapped that you can say that it costs them $4.70 per dollar, but they would never afford that. It just means quality of life will diminish. And in fact, we're building some suburbs and other places with no provision for any religious institutional space. And I would say the long-term prognosis for those communities is that it's going to be difficult. They're going to face uphill battles. So whether it's $4.77 or $2.77 or whether we've calculated everything in, it is in a sense kind of illustrative of the point that they're not, you can't just automatically say it's negative. We put a pin in the board to say, no, it's positive. If you want to provide counter evidence, great. Let's talk about it. We need more research on these groups. And there's clearly not enough done. Ram's a leading pioneer. I asked him when I met with him years ago. I said, who else is doing this? He says, nobody. We're leading the edge. And Ram himself is not a person of faith. He doesn't, but he just has studied them and said, these are remarkable entities in the landscape. What are these things? Well, they're these congregations. So it's quite interesting actually to see that develop. So where did I say we'd go? Oh, yeah, there. Yeah, and then.
Just a comment, I'm a former city planner, now a pastor, and I would say among my colleagues, and so this is more of an exhortation, this stuff, learning just even a little bit of this, helps you avoid accidentally encouraging actions by your city that will have long-term negative consequences. So knowing even a little bit of this, just reading one of these things, would help you when you are in a meeting for some other random reason to not accidentally encourage something that will have long-term negative consequences. It's just a really
good point.
lens.
I would also suggest that I think most of the people that should be involved in these structural strategic things aren't the pastor. I think in all of your groups there is that one or two people who, like myself, have that a certain nerd gene along the line that just need to be released to go and say, pay attention to this for us. I'm not suggesting you need to do this. In fact, I would argue, find someone else. Somebody around you gets really excited thinking about this stuff. It might be strange. I mean, there's people around me who don't really, this is odd stuff. Why do you like doing this? I don't know, but I do, and I think it's important. So just encourage you, I think, along that somebody needs to be literate. You don't all need to be literate. We don't all need to be doing this. But somebody needs to be, and that could be a really valuable piece in the puzzle. Yeah.
My question was right along the lines of that last
statement.
Okay.
Kind
of take it one more level down to ground level. What does this look like in a local congregation? So whether it's on the training, and you were talking about structural city planning kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Do you run members through a training, or do you bring someone in to do some kind of training? Do you, you talk about having one nerd person going at it, but do you actually dig that more into sort of leadership life and how you're thinking and how you're investing in the city? Because it seems like it would take a sort of a shift in perspective.
I'll just give one example, which is in one community, after about 2 or 3 years of meetings with planning people and various pastoral leaders and multi-faith, so across the board, I had enough trust with them I could bring them together, and we did an evening called Planning in Good Faith. And I had some planners present, this is Planning 101. This is what planners do. It's a really complicated job. It's a very difficult job. It's a thankless job. We have 50 bosses and 50 experts we have to coordinate, and most of the time, this is what we do. These are the laws. These are the acts we have to follow. This is all the stuff, the legal requirements, etc. And then I had the pastoral side present, this is Faith 101 for the planning side to say, congregations and faith communities are not the same as a business, or they're not the same as the arts group. They're not the same. They have there are some commonalities, but they're also kind of odd creatures as well. And here's what's beautifully odd about them, right? Just tell us. So that was one example where bringing a network of them together kind of was fine. Within a congregation or church plant, I think it's the beginning of just that, even the early literacy of just thinking about how does the space around it speaks some sort of, it's talking, it's telling us something, it's helping our mission or it's hindering our mission, but just maybe being more attentive even to the space around us. At a congregation level, you can't change a lot, but you can change your space, you can change your position, even your location. Where congregation members live is about the most important vote they're going to make in their life. We don't think that's that significant. It is. Very few things you do will matter as much as where you choose to buy a house or where you choose to live. So those are a couple. It's not a great thorough answer, but a few things for you. Yeah.
This is just a comment, but what you can't do physically, you can also do relationally. So I'm a Moody church person, and our building manager, he would go out and he would introduce himself to every one of these shops and stores and businesses in this community.
Yeah.
And when we were going to have a large event that was going to put pressure on parking and put pressure on service, he would go out, he would give them tickets and invite them. And so then when we needed something one time from our government and we went, and they gave it to us without even blinking. And you know why? They said, every morning we would go out and we had people sweeping the streets in front of our. We didn't give two thoughts to that.
No.
But so it was a relational thing that we didn't do structurally.
One of the resources I skipped by is a book by June Hawley called The Network Weaver's Handbook. The person you're describing is what she would call is this network weaver. And these can happen not only locally but institutionally. People who are just good at being the connectors. And it's a tremendously relational space, all of this. I started with the social on purpose. These are not just sort of policy structural things. Even the policy side, deeply relational. And that's a great example. That has huge implications there, and then we'll go there.
I regret I just got in, so I missed the whole seminar.
Okay, we'll start over. Okay, back to slide 1. Here we go, everybody.
The question is, our church is urban, but our congregation is suburban.
Yeah.
How do we get them to see the city, to care of the city? Maybe you covered that already.
Well, one thing I did at one congregation we were at downtown was to just take the addresses of all the members and create a map and put that onto Google. And they kept talking about we're a neighborhood church, and it's like just put that map up and said we may serve this neighborhood, we may have ministries in this neighborhood. We are not a neighborhood church. Nobody lives within 5 miles of here. So it used to be they were a neighborhood church, right? People now zero. I think we were the closest, and we were like 4 or 5 miles away. Like it's just so it was sort of truth telling to say, let's just be honest. We're ministering in this neighborhood, but we're not. This is not a neighborhood church.
We're not yet ministering in the neighborhood. We need to have our
You're right.
congregation embrace this vision.
And a part of it is talking to people about what if you want a better life. We need to actually be closer to each other. Now, it's not just for the sake of our neighborhood, but we actually won't be a real congregation, a real community of faith, if we only ever see each other on Sunday mornings and we never bump it. Like that can't work. It works to a point, but that's not a real community. So I think actually people want more. So you're not selling. I think they just need a pathway often to say, what if a church, how often, it rarely happens, the church says, we need a bunch of you to move a lot closer. We need you to move into this neighborhood. Now, there are ministries and movements that way, but it's not uncommon to say where you live matters. So, encourage them to do that. Yeah.
I don't know if you're introducing differences on how these can be applied, I guess, and from like the large church versus the small church plan focusing. I'm just I'm listening to you. I'm thinking. So, for example, I don't know. It's like Redeemer things. Redeemer probably has connections with the larger city structures because of how big they are.
Yeah.
But the small church plan, kind of how you do it bottom up instead of top down.
I think it has nothing to do with size. At whatever size you are, there is something that you might do that sort of engages with your city structurally. Simple as sweeping this stuff in front of a business, or doing something in the community that's missing. Some communities, they start with a service model and say, what's missing in this community? There's no playground. What if we built a playground? I don't know. So that's not changing the whole city, but it's a structural piece, right? It's actually, so I would just say, I think our responses are always in scale to the size of who we are. And if we're too small and there's a bigger problem, then we have to find other small pieces. And we build that network and we create that structural density to now we can interact with that thing, right? So I think we can move that all the way up through the scales. And that's, because there's no one size fits all for any of this. And Redeemer would be the same. If you talk to them, look at their trajectory on different ministries, you'd see how they've grown that way too. Little piece here, moves forward, etc. Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up. I'll stay here if you want to talk some more. I'm happy to come back.